Hello everyone, my name is Jocelyn Volk. I am the team leader for Russia B. As Professor Kalanick said, we will be arguing the tough line position on Russia. To my left, I have Sam Siegel, who is the expert in regional affairs, Kevin Deptula, who is the expert in economic affairs, and Sarah Wesier, who is the expert in military affairs. So we'd like to start off with, why is Russia a threat? U.S. security relies on a liberal international order in which European stability plays a critical role. Russian aggression and Russia's quest for regional hegemony violates this order and threatens U.S. leadership. It is within the U.S.'s foreign policy interest to protect and support its European allies as well as the sovereignty of other threatened nations within the region. In light of recent events, some rhetoric has pointed to a threat of a new Cold War, in which Russia would reabsorb the former Soviet states as a front against the West. This rhetoric talks past the real threat, which is not of a new Russian or Soviet empire, but of Russia having a harmful level of influence over the rest of Europe. Russia's actions threaten to create a new status quo in which a local revisionist power can violate the sovereignty of other nations without retribution. Now, understanding why Russia is a threat, we can look further at what could possibly go wrong. A plausible scenario is a renewed Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, meaning that while Russia will not occupy or conquer neighboring states, it will have the relative economic and military power to exercise its influence in the region at the expense of US and NATO interests. Russia could accomplish this sphere of influence through its pseudo-military actions like backing separatists and protecting ethnic Russians, and its importance in the Eastern European energy economy. Russia's ability to do this is only exacerbated by a perceived lack of US will to intervene, as Eastern European nations, wary of Russian power, may believe that the US will not come to their aid and capitulate to Russian demands. As a result of these developments, Russia could establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and become a regional hegemon. A purely diplomatic approach to dealing with Russia would be misguided because it would underestimate Russia's ambitions and mischaracterize Putin's conception of power relations. The US should instead seek a strategy of long-term rollback, short-term containment, using military and economic means as well as regional diplomacy in order to place greater pressure, allowing for indirect influence over Russia's policy decisions. Long-term rollback, short-term containment is a two-pronged strategy designed to accomplish our policy goals in the region. The first prong involves indirectly influencing Russia's policy decisions using economic and diplomatic means, particularly in the form of multilateral sanctions. This long-term prong will exacerbate Russia's internal problems, economic and political, and will eventually force Russian lawmakers to surrender Crimea. The short-term prong involves militarily deterring Russia from expanding its influence beyond its current position in Crimea. This is a kind of containment, but it is not Cold War containment. It is limited to Eastern Europe, demands a multilateral, US-led approach, and lacks an ideological dimension. It also differs from Cold War containment because it acknowledges that Russia today is in decline. We argue this decline can be manipulated to serve our interests in the region. Our interests in the region are amplified by the NATO alliance and should subsequently serve its goals as well. So why NATO? Central to this world order is a strong, united NATO capable of protecting the liberal international order in Europe. Our interests depend on reaffirming US support for NATO. During the Cold War, NATO was the linchpin of European stability. NATO remains a valuable partner for the US. The war on terror, in particular, showed the power of multilateral action in the face of a common threat. While some may argue that we should leave Europe to balance a revisionist Russia, our strategy is rooted in a US-led liberal world order, and we believe that the balance of power strategy could return us to the power politics that started 2 world wars. It is necessary to actively defend the status quo in Europe, especially with an aggressive revisionist power on its periphery. NATO cannot continue to serve our interests unless we give it the teeth to protect this status quo. We must reassure countries that may feel the need to capitulate to Russia that any Russian aggression will be deterred by the promise of superior force. NATO is both a means and an end for our strategy of long-term rollback and short-term containment. Now knowing our strategy, we can move on to our interpretation of events. Russian decline is dangerous. Putin distracts from internal dissent by drawing the public attention to wars in the near abroad. Russia has lost the glory of its two great empires and feels that the status quo, while temporarily acceptable following the Cold War, denies Russia its fair share of power in its own backyard. We would like to assert that while we take a strong stance against Russia, it is what we perceive as their weakness as a state that makes them dangerous. Many in Russia, including Putin, seem eager to reclaim their former sphere of influence and restore Russia's international prestige. These aspirations have led to disastrous developments on the ground. International law, a critical part of the liberal international order, guarantees the sovereignty of states. Russia's actions in Ukraine and Georgia show their blatant disregard for international institutions. Not only does Russia not respect the sovereignty of neighboring states in Eastern Europe, it views many of these states as fundamentally illegitimate. Ukraine, which will be a focus of our presentation, means borderland in Russian, while its capital, Kiev, is thought to be the cradle of Russian civilization. These links, as well as the presence of Russian irredentists across Eastern Europe, make many Russians feel as though their neighboring states should be truly a part of Russia, and if not a part of Russia, then at least within their orbit. Russia thus feels entitled to significant influence in Eastern Europe. As we will discuss, this sense of entitlement and its consequent developments in the past few years threaten the US-led liberal international order that has kept Europe secure for the last half a century. At this moment in history, when the world detects a lack of will on the part of the US to enforce its global leadership, it is critical to reaffirm our commitment to a world order that protects our interests. Some suggest that NATO expansion provoked a defensive response from Russia. While this is not an implausible explanation, there are more plausible, more worrisome explanations for Russian aggression. The 2008 financial crisis emboldened Russia and China, both regional powers, to challenge the US-led world order because they perceived that the US was too economically constrained to sustain their unipolar power. The fact that Russia has been emboldened to act as a regional hegemon is a dangerous development because the power of Russian nationalism to act as an impetus to establish a Russian-led sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, particularly under the guise of protecting ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. This is exemplified by Georgia in 2008, where Russia was further emboldened when its aggression was met by hesitation and division on the part of NATO, which signaled to Putin that his interference with Russia's neighbors would go unpunished. Shortly, we will examine the situation in Georgia in greater depth. This region, thus, suffers from a power imbalance in which a local power, Russia, feels emboldened to violate the sovereignty of its neighboring states. Such a power imbalance is fundamentally unsustainable. The claim that NATO provoked Russia, therefore, falls short of fully explaining recent events. Our alternative explanations point to a more aggressive Russia. In short, having a regional revisionist power that is opposed to the current world order causes instability of power within the region. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sam to talk about regional affairs.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So I'll begin by talking about the general facts of the region and then go more into depth about Georgia, Ukraine, and other cases. So first, Russia uses its military to support separatists and Russian irredentists in order to take power in or destabilize neighboring countries. So how does this relate to our conception of Russia as a threat? Well, the international order is dependent on stability and sovereignty. And when regional powers can destabilize their neighbors and violate their sovereignty at will, this threatens the system that we seek to promote and uphold. In Georgia, Russia supports separatists and occupies much of the country's territory. In the Ukraine, there is a large Russian intervention involving more support for separatists and the annexation of Crimea, as well as Russian bullying over energy. In the Baltic states, there are large Russian populations and intense Russian energy dependence. Only NATO membership protects these countries from Russian military aggression. In Eastern Europe in general, there's more dependence on Russian energy and more threats of separatist and unconventional wars sponsored by Russia. Our strategy can mitigate these threats and keep Russia in its place. Now on to Georgia. Before it was invaded by Russia in 2008, ostensibly over separatist tensions, Georgia aspired to EU and NATO membership, which would represent a renunciation of membership in the Russian sphere of influence in favor of the Western sphere. Clearly, the true cause of the invasion was Russian horror at a neighbor leaving their sphere of influence. The Western response to this war was weak. French-led ceasefire negotiations sacrificed the principles of national sovereignty, which are key to the international system, in exchange for an agreement that left Russia in control of the Georgian territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The U.S. did nothing beyond sending humanitarian aid to Georgia. This weak and feckless response showed Russia that its expansionism would be tolerated by the Western powers. Russia's 2014 invasion or intervention in Ukraine saw Russia annex Crimea and use separatists to destabilize eastern Ukraine. The annexation was a blatant and open violation of international law, and the Western response has not been harsh enough. The invasion was caused by Ukrainian support for EU affiliation over a customs union with Russia. This would have formally excluded Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence, an exclusion which Russia could not tolerate. Other regional concerns include the Baltics, with large Russian populations who could rise up with Russian provocation, as well as other countries who could fall victim to Russian irredentism. European dependence on Russian natural gas also represents a regional threat in the form of arbitrary price hikes or shutoffs of natural gas flow that could upset regional economies. Now, the main goal of our regional policy recommendations is to strengthen the U.S. and its allies through intergovernmental organizations that stabilize countries and secure their sovereignty. These organizations, such as NATO and the EU, promote the international order that the U.S. leads and seeks to continue. In order to secure threatened countries in the region, while acting in accordance with the long-term rollback aspect of our strategy, we should expand NATO as much as possible within Eastern Europe. We will try to add countries such as Finland, which have strategic positions in Eastern Europe but are not occupied by Russia. Given recent Russian behavior, we will convince these countries that NATO membership is the safest option. In fact, Finland's current government is considering abandoning its neutrality to join NATO in order to secure their country from Russia. We will also make Russian occupations in Ukraine and Georgia extremely costly, forcing Russia to change its strategic calculations. Once Russia can be diplomatically forced out of Ukraine and Georgia, we will admit those two countries to NATO to protect them from further Russian aggression. This strategy will also require extensive regional cooperation with our allies and the EU in order to build greater mutual security and energy independence from Russia. Areas include coordination of troop placement and energy policies. One particular policy is that our allies should be incentivized to strengthen their militaries and apply sanctions to Russia in exchange for U.S. investment in energy independence policies. And I'd like to turn it over to Kevin to talk more about the economic and energy threats.
Thank you, Sam. So now that we've dealt with Russia's actions in the region and our regional responses, I will discuss how Russia's economy, while struggling, presents an economic threat to Eastern Europe. So the Russian economy pales in comparison to that of the United States. It has been contracting, and reports from both the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development indicate that it will continue to contract until at least 2016. There is no denying that Russia's economy is declining. However, it has one key advantage that makes it an influential player in the region: its near monopoly on gas flow to Eastern Europe. The Baltic states and Finland import all of their natural gas from Russia, while Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia import a large majority of their natural gas from Russia. A chart shown here lays out through multiple measures just how dependent upon Russian natural gas European nations are. Now, the important thing to note here is that the countries in the top left corner of this chart are those that are most dependent on Russian natural gas. Most of them are Eastern and Central European. Also, most of them, depicted with red circles, are categorized as insecure by the European Council on Foreign Relations, since those would be the nations that would face the most serious hardships should Russia decide to cut off the gas flow. But why would Russia cut off the gas flow? I mean, after all, Russia depends on gas, and energy generally makes up about half of its total exports. However, it is important to keep in mind Russia's goals. Russia wants to reestablish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And although Russia cannot sustain a long-term loss in the economic sphere, Putin may deem short-term economic losses as necessary to preserve the Russian sphere of influence. Thus, Eastern Europe's dependency upon Russian natural gas can act as Russia's trump card, and one that Eastern European nations are rightfully nervous about. It is the credible threat of cutting gas flow that could incentivize Eastern European countries to capitulate to Russian demands. This economic coercion is detrimental to U.S. foreign policy interests and detrimental to the U.S.-led international order. So now that we've dealt with how Russia's economy threatens Eastern Europe, I'll discuss our major policy response, which is multilateral, intensified sanctions. These sanctions will accomplish the goals of the long-term rollback portion of our strategy. So why impose further sanctions upon Russia? Well, we have the past year or so of sanctions to look to for justification. Over the past year, the US and various Western nations, including the EU nations, Canada, and Australia, have imposed rounds of sanctions upon Russia. The first few rounds targeted specific individuals in Russian society, while the later rounds targeted specific sectors of the Russian economy, such as energy and finance. Now, reports suggest that these sanctions have successfully contracted Russia's economy, and furthermore have had numerous other effects, including causing extreme volatility of the ruble on the foreign exchange market, and causing a sharp decrease in investment and consumption due to a lack of consumer confidence. So the current sanctions have clearly had a negative impact on Russia's economy, and by increasing the intensity of these sanctions, Russia's economic situation should continue to deteriorate and internal pressure should continue to build, in line with our strategy of long-term rollback. Now, it is the intention of these sanctions to target the elite classes of Russia, and not everyday Russians. The working classes of Russia have little political influence on Russian policy, so cries for relief from these people would most likely fall on deaf ears in Russian government. Those who have the power to influence Russian policy are the elites. Although the effectiveness of targeted sanctions has been questioned, these forms of sanctions have generally been accepted by the international community and provide several advantages in that they usually do not bear significant humanitarian consequences and they are more flexible. Finally, these sanctions should be multilateral to truly make an impact. This chart shown here depicts Russian economic links with various nations in Europe. Now, red indicates high involvement, while the gray colors indicate little to no involvement economically. As you can see, it is the numerous Eastern European states that have high degrees of economic links to Russia. And so severing or reducing the magnitude of these links through sanctions imposed by Eastern and Central European nations could really intensify the effects of these sanctions upon Russia. Now, the protection of these states from the destabilizing potential of Russia should be reason enough for them to join our sanctions program. However, we understand that these sanctions, along with harming Russia, could also put pressure on the economies of Eastern and Central European countries. So to combat this pitfall, we are proposing a deal to European nations. In exchange for their cooperation with our sanctions regime and their cooperation with our defensive goals in the region, we will provide support to help diversify their energy programs. Now, this support could take multiple forms, including investing in technology and green energy, funding the opening of more LNG terminals in Europe, and providing funds to speed the building of the Southern Gas Corridor, a pipeline that completely avoids Russia. Now, the specifics of these support mechanisms could be discussed at later meetings, but the general idea here is to kill two birds with one stone, to get Eastern Europe on board with our sanctions regime, and to make Eastern and Central Europe less dependent on Russian natural gas. Both of these benefits coincide with our strategy of long-term rollback, and the second benefit especially increases the stability of Eastern Europe, and more importantly, increases the stability of our liberal international order. The sanctions, meanwhile, will stay in effect until state sovereignty, a pillar of the liberal order, has been respected by Russia. Now remember, the ultimate goal of these sanctions is to have Russia respect the sovereignty of its neighboring states, in a sense, to play by the rules of the international system. So when imposing these sanctions, we will make it clear to Russia that the sanctions will be lifted should Crimea be ceded back to Ukraine. Thus, multilateral sanctions are a central pillar of our plan of long-term rollback. With that, I will turn it to Sarah to discuss military issues.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'd like to introduce the Russian military threat by first addressing two important misconceptions about Russian military power. The first is the assumption that because the Russian military pales in comparison to the U.S., to that of the U.S. in both conventional and nuclear measures, that Russia is not a threat to the U.S. While it is true that the U.S. is militarily superior, the threat we're discussing is of Russia using its relative regional power to bully weaker states in Eastern Europe and U.S. allies in the region. While it is true that their recent surge in defense spending from 3.4 to 3.6% of their GDP will temporarily bolster their conventional power, this spending is unsustainable, considering the state of Russia's economy. Based on the evidence, then, there's little to fear from Russia's conventional military. Instead, the world should be concerned about its limited covert operations, including cyber warfare and the deployment of unmarked special forces or little green men in Eastern Europe, as we saw in Ukraine. The second misconception, forgot my slide. That was the first misconception up there. The second misconception is that Russia's economic weakness translates to military impotence. The reality is that Russian strategy takes into account this disadvantage. Russia has crafted a strategy of military interference on a budget. Rather than deploy costly conventional forces, Russia relies on covert actions led by its special forces to aid existing indigenous separatist movements. This strategy is inexpensive compared to conventional tactics of invasion and occupation. Further complicating Russia's military threat is the fact that Russia remains a nuclear power and is willing to quickly remind the world of that fact. It assumes that its nuclear capabilities excuse its limited military operations in Eastern Europe, and thus far this rhetoric has successfully deterred any significant Western response. So, before I talk about Ukraine, actually, I'd like to say that it's important to keep in mind what the Russian military is and what the Russian military is not. It is not an especially well-funded, professional, or modern army ready to march through Europe to cause World War III. It is a force that recognizes its own disadvantages and proceeds accordingly, using operations that, while covert and limited, still pose a significant threat to European stability and U.S. interests. I'll now talk a bit about Russian military strategy in Ukraine and Georgia to offer a sense of what military intervention looks like. I'll then go on to describe our strategy based on the lessons of these campaigns. So Russia's covert methods are most visible in the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, in which it used unmarked special forces to detach Crimea and destabilize separatist regions in the eastern part of the country. This covert strategy is cheap and relatively effective. Because it took so long for the international community to officially verify that the unmarked troops were from Russia, Russia managed to carry out the invasion without provoking any immediate response. These covert operations did not strictly avoid conventional warfare. The shooting down of a Malaysia air flight with anti-aircraft weapons clearly shows that even limited military operations can have disastrous consequences with huge loss of life. Georgia is a victim to the same geopolitical problem that Ukraine faces now. Preparing for a Russian military threat, it would thus be prudent to look back even further to the 2008 invasion of Georgia as a prequel to the current crisis. Compared to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia relied on entirely conventional forces to cut off the power of the Georgian government in the contested regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These conventional forces, as I will discuss in a moment, did not make an impressive showing. Furthermore, they relied heavily on tanks and air power in the form of helicopter gunships and fighter aircraft. Russia also deployed railroad troops to protect the supply line of aid from Russia to the Georgian rebels. As Sam has already described, Russia's blatant violations of international law in Georgia were met with a weak response from NATO. This inaction revealed a dangerous unwillingness to enforce the liberal international order. So we can learn a lot going forward from what unfolded in Georgia. The experience of Georgia, after all, will inform how the situation in Ukraine develops. The three major lessons are as follows. First, we saw that the Russian military, while successful in its immediate mission in Georgia, was unprofessional and poorly prepared for war. These shortcomings further inform our reasonable assumption that Russia will not quickly resort to relying on its conventional military. Second, Russia clearly depended on specific types of tactics, including the use of air power and the protection of vulnerable supply lines. Our military policy, which I will describe in just a moment, will take into account the best way to address these specific kinds of military strategies. Third, the international community must collectively condemn Russian actions in a way it did not following Georgia. The failure of NATO to respond in a unified and decisive way to Russia's invasion of Georgia undermined the credibility of the organization and, by extension, U.S. security interests. Our future actions must correct for this troubling misstep. So the premise of our plan for short-term containment, which I'll describe in more detail in a moment, is that Russia will likely avoid open war. It simply cannot afford the economic costs or the risk of public opinion turning against the Putin regime. Our short-term containment strategy is to deter further aggression beyond Russia's current position in Crimea. It is meant to complement the long-term rollback strategy that Kevin and Sam described earlier. Okay, and now into the details. The short-term containment strategy deters further Russian aggression with a credible threat of superior force. Such a threat would rely on a strong front by expanded NATO. Sam earlier mentioned the need to expand NATO and strengthen our allies. Specifically, we should be building up conventional forces in the NATO countries closest to Russia and the Ukraine. Placing troops in Poland, the Baltics, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia would best position NATO to respond forcefully and quickly to any further Russian aggression should it occur. These troops should include a significant number of military advisors. After all, many of these countries, especially Poland and the Baltics, are already upping their individual defense capabilities and only require coordination. These military advisors will help to streamline their efforts. Further military exercises will also demonstrate NATO's ability to mobilize if necessary. The deployment of small deterrence forces in western Ukraine, too, will work to contain Russia to its current position in Crimea by threatening broader involvement. These forces should be large enough to pose a credible threat to Russian expansion and thus contain Russia to Crimea. After all, the most important thing to remember about short-term containment is that Russia will likely avoid a costly open war in which it is forced to use conventional forces instead of its little green men. Current U.S. aid, which takes the form of non-lethal and limited lethal aid to western Ukraine, represents more of a symbolic condemnation of Russian aggression than actual strategic preparation. The provision of more lethal aid and the deployment of meaningful forces will send a stronger message to Putin and will more likely deter further aggression. This lethal aid should correspond with Russian tactics, as I explained before, in order to target Russia's vulnerabilities. The provision of anti-aircraft weaponry, anti-tank missiles, like those already accumulating in the Baltic states, and any equipment necessary to target vulnerable Russian supply lines would best suit the existing threat. Military containment will limit Russia to its current position. But what do we do about Crimea? Do we just sacrifice it to Russian annexation? The answer is no, but our strategy will need to play the longer game in order to back up this conviction. Military containment is only the short-term aspect of our strategy. It thus stops short of restoring Crimea to Ukraine. The long-term prong of our strategy, however, uses economic and diplomatic tactics in the form of multilateral sanctions and coordination, as Sam and Kevin described earlier, to pressure Russia into changing its policies and surrendering Crimea. Long-term rollback essentially forces Russia out of Ukraine by making its annexation too costly to sustain in the long term. It would be easy enough to leave Crimea to Russia and call it a day. But the United States must stand by its commitment to protecting state sovereignty, without which our liberal international order would be meaningless. And I'll hand it back to Jocelyn to wrap up.
Thanks, Sarah, and to all of our experts. So to finish up, our strategy of long-term rollback, short-term containment will work to limit Russia to its own borders, secure a stable NATO-led Europe, and foster energy independence for Europe. All of these points are meant to sustain and secure the post-Cold War status quo. Over the long term, our individual policy recommendations in military, economic, and regional affairs will allow the United States to combat Russian aggression. To sum up the policy recommendations, we believe that the following actions should be taken: NATO expansion, increased sanctions, deterrence forces in Western Ukraine, increased lethal aid, independent energy investment, and a bolstering and coordinating of NATO forces in the region. Ultimately, these measures will contain Russia to its own borders, cause internal strife, and force Russia to capitulate to U.S. demands to cede back parts of eastern Ukraine, specifically Crimea. In conclusion, we advocate for a strategy of long-term rollback, short-term containment to combat an aggressive Russia. Failing to punish Russia for its aggression will only embolden Putin to chip away further at the sovereignty of neighboring states. We believe that Russia's actions in Eastern Europe make them a threat to U.S. security interests, and that our strategy will ultimately force Russia to curb its aggression and not upend the current world order. The stability of the current liberal international order is crucial to U.S. foreign policy, as well as the safety of our allies. Our policy recommendations would allow for the continuance of the US-led world order and would convince Russia to play by the rules of this system. Thank you, and we open the floor for questions.
Sure. I'll just start with one question. So I thought you guys did a great job as presenters. The question I have is about expansion of NATO to Georgia in particular. So I will admit, and I'll even grant you guys, that if you expand NATO to Georgia, it deters Russia a bit. It makes it maybe less likely they're going to invade in any form, whether little green men or conventionally. But one of the concerns is when you admit someone to NATO, you're giving them a security guarantee. And so you're bringing in the issue of wills here. On the United States side, I'm not positive that American leaders or the American public are willing to commit U.S. troops to a significant fight to defend Georgia. In fact, when 2008 and this conflict was happening, you pretty much had John McCain saying we needed to be more on the side of what was going on in Georgia. Most Americans, couldn't really care less, weren't, at the battlements saying we should get in there. So I guess the question I have is, maybe initially admitting Georgia to NATO would slightly deter Russia, but what about the scenario where Russia then does this little green men thing anyway? U.S. is then not having strategic flexibility, not able to kind of decide whether to get involved or not. We're committed to defending them as a NATO partner. And I'm not sure that the balance of wills favors the United States there. Russia has committed troops there and has shown that Georgia is very important to them. I'm not so sure it's important to the United States. So how do you respond to that and how do you deal with that issue?
You want to take that?
I'll start. So I think there are a few things that we can do, and I think most importantly is to prevent the little green men scenario from, do everything we can to prevent the sort of another little green men scenario from happening. We need to be really clear in our language that a little green men attack really violates, the sovereignty of Georgia, would represent, it would invoke Article 5 that would allow all of NATO to get involved. And basically do whatever we can to deter Russia in the first place. I think we could, at the very least, we could sort of change the language that's used to sort of appeal to the American people, sort of make it clear how much of a threat Russia is to our interests in the region and what we want. But yeah, I think the real sort of the primary thing that we should be doing there is preventing a Russian sort of attack from happening in the first place, so that sort of the battle of wills becomes sort of irrelevant. We don't think Putin would want to risk a conventional war, we don't think he would want to risk a conventional war against U.S. forces.
I might add just one thing, that I think our plan basically puts, we acknowledge that there isn't a ton of will in the U.S. to defend Georgia or Ukraine. Ask the average American to say where Georgia or Ukraine is, they might not even know. But the purpose of our plan is to put the U.S. in a position of coordinating and supporting NATO and empowering NATO to take responsibility of their own region. Because European stability is in our interest, but they should be kind of taking on more responsibility for those threats. So hopefully that would convince the American public more that this is a viable strategy.
Makes total sense. Just quick follow-up, not a question, just a point. I think that's a good argument. I would just say Russia invading Georgia the way that it has is a problem. Russia invading Georgia and the U.S. not responding when it's a NATO member is a disaster. So you're really upping the stakes there. I just want to make sure you understand the stakes of that. But I think your responses are well taken.
Sure. I guess I have 3 questions, but 2 of them go to Sam and the third goes to Jocelyn. Sam, I want you to expand. I would actually make the same point that Peter did, but more. What's the American plan with branches here? Clearly there's an asymmetry in wills, but also there's an asymmetry in logistics. Russia's right there. The United States is far away. So how does the United States establish escalation dominance in this scenario, both in Georgia and in Russia or in Ukraine, given that the logistics are tough and the motivation is tough and the time horizon is probably longer for the Russians who care more about it than the Americans? Second question is, the EU makes a cameo in your talk. Right. It's centered around NATO, but the EU shows up. And I was wondering if you could maybe expand on how this fits in, how the EU fits in with U.S. national interests in general. And then, just to do this round robin, over to you, Jocelyn. You talked about the sources of boldness or emboldenment was the perception of U.S. economic weakness, the 2008 financial crisis, which also hit Russia as well, but probably not as bad. The point being, though, that the United States has been doing much better than Russia for some time. So if the sources of emboldenment are economic, then that undermines your case that now is the time to be tougher with them. So if you guys handle that however, whatever order you want to handle that in.
I guess for the first question, a lot of it is sort of goes to what Sarah was talking about sort of forced placement in Eastern Europe, and I think probably when I'm sort of done, maybe you'd be better to elaborate on that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's about sort of getting a coordinated NATO effort in order to sort of make sure that we have enough in place that Russia is deterred from entering Ukraine or our other NATO allies in the future. I mean, once even if they're not only American troops, once there are troops there on the ground like that can get there quickly, then we sort of dealt with the logistical hurdles. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, so I made a point about sending military advisors to those countries closest, the NATO countries closest to Russia and the Ukraine. And the purpose of that was to basically, coordinate the efforts from those countries. So I think it would kind of mitigate the disadvantage that the U.S. has in terms of, knowing the area and, being familiar with the territory that we would be working with the countries that are in that area and kind of taking, not a backseat, but a more leadership role just to coordinate their efforts and not tell them how to proceed necessarily, but to make sure that the efforts from those countries represent one united front against Russia.
And I'll take your question so Sam has a little more time. So I completely agree that the U.S. has bounced back economically, and therefore you could seem that emboldenment would wear off. However, I think our point during the presentation of talking about the emboldenment following the 2008 financial crisis was that China and Russia both, but more specifically China, given our presentation, took actions during that time because they were emboldened then, and then those actions were met with hesitation and divisiveness on the part of NATO. And so from that, Putin has continued to act in an emboldened way. And so when we argue for an expansion of NATO and a stronger NATO alliance, it's to face that emboldenment. So while I agree the U.S. has bounced back economically, I think the economic argument was the starting point to really push Putin to make these actions, and it was the hesitation and the lack of action on the part of NATO that we're saying is the cause for the continued action.
And the by then obvious failure of the Iraq War was probably also a big factor in undermining the U.S.'s leadership.
Yeah, sure. So for the EU, I mean, it's not sort of a focal point of our presentation because the U.S. is not a member, but I think the idea is that the EU is another institution that sort of promotes sort of sovereignty, stability, whatever interconnectedness within Europe, and that sort of goes with what we're trying to achieve. And even though the EU is not a security organization in the same way NATO is, if Russia were to invade an EU member, it would cause even more perhaps like uproar within Europe. And so while the U.S. is not, while the U.S. may not control whether the EU expands or not, it might be something that, it would be something that perhaps would be good for our sort of liberal order if the EU were to expand into Ukraine and Georgia, assuming those countries are interested. Does that sort of address the question?
So just a few questions, and these will be a little broader. I found your presentation to be extremely convincing and reasonable, which is why it scares me. So let me push your logic a little bit further. You are talking about increasing sanctions and stripping Russia of its resources to the point that it can bring it to economic collapse. If Russia is forced to cede Crimea, in order to avoid that outcome, there will be such a political backlash within Russia as to cause the fall of the government. Are you trying to tell me that a weak, ungoverned Russia in Europe and Asia makes the United States more secure in the liberal international order than a sense of an ordered government? How are you prepared to deal with that scenario?
Yeah, all right, I'll take that one. So I think I definitely agree that that pushes where we're going with it. Is basically, there would be a huge backlash against Putin. We talk about how he draws internal dissent to focus on wars in the near abroad as Crimea. I think from our position, it is basically we cannot concede Crimea. We cannot, from our stance as taking the aggressive hard line against Russia, we cannot say we advocate for state sovereignties and that every state in the liberal international order is guaranteed state sovereignty, but just kidding, not Ukraine. So I think when we make this argument that we're imposing harsh multilateral sanctions, and then we will let up on those once Russia agrees to cede back Crimea, we hope in that sense that that does not cause a collapse in the government. We are not arguing for an overthrow of Russian government. We are saying that if they cede back Crimea, the sanctions that we are imposing will then be lifted. While that may not completely remedy all internal problems, and we're not saying that it's going to, it's also not our job to fix Russia's internal problems. And I agree that it is a security issue if Russia's government does collapse. But we have dealt with the collapse of a Russian government once before. And if anyone else wants to jump here at any point, go for it.
So our group has talked a lot about Putin being able to take home a victory in a sense, that he values his reputation a lot and stakes a lot on his reputation. But it's also very hard to know how he'll spin different developments. It usually takes an anti-Western spin, pro-Russian spin, pro-Putin spin. But I think that should the situation you described occur, Putin could easily describe the lifting of sanctions as his victory, as saving the Russian economy. There's going to be a win and a loss, and I think he will learn to spin it and use it to his advantage. And so I don't think it would spell complete disaster for the internal stability of Russia.
Great. Can I ask one more?
Absolutely.
I want to ask about NATO at the crux of this. In some ways, NATO has become a shorthand for this nice European tool that the United States can use. But NATO ultimately is a complex of allies and relations among states. The politics of NATO during the Cold War themselves were fraught. The United States couldn't get France to behave most of the time. So I'm a little unclear how the United States is going to get countries like Georgia, which is a huge moral hazard problem, Hungary, which has itself recently denounced the liberal international order, and various nations that aren't exactly quite totally friendly to the United States to do precisely what we want. So how do you see the United States shaping those alliance relations in ways that sound like they're just as effective as those during the Cold War?
I think there's a lot to say about an outside threat being hopefully uniting Europe in their convictions to defend themselves, especially those countries that are bordering the Ukraine, and those countries that have really high populations of Russian irredentists and ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, that could be next should the scenario we described happen. So I think that, and for a lot of those countries do see this threat of Russia and are not necessarily working together at this stage, but are preparing themselves and could easily be brought into cooperation with each other in a really effective way. So.
Thank you.
Do you have time for one question?
One more quick one.
Okay. Can I do the kind of twofer in one? Because I have a quick follow-up to that. You guys can pick what you want to do. So following on Stacey's question, this is something that came up a little bit yesterday, but on the one hand, you guys say the problem with Russia is they're a threat to be a regional hegemon, right? Which makes sense. But then you also say the problem with Russia is that they're threatening, when they're weak, that's when they want to lash out, right? So I guess you're kind of implying there's some Goldilocks level of what Russian power should be. So I kind of am interested in knowing, what is the level of Russian power that's somehow most stable for the region and most helpful for the United States? And I was also struck by the fact that you said this is not an ideological struggle. So if it's not ideological at all, what exactly is the challenge Russia poses? Is it its power? Because you're kind of saying that it's these kind of hybrid warfare things are inherently self-limiting because you can't do a covert invasion anywhere you don't have co-ethnics and people who are going to follow you. So the challenge is kind of power, but then it's both too much or too little power, and it's not ideological. So can you clarify a little bit for me what the stable Russia is? Because we can't just wish them out of existence. They're going to be there. So, what's the Russia that you would like to have as, if not a partner, then kind of a neighbor in the region?
I'll just address the ideology part really fast. So the ideology part is kind of tricky because we do see Russian nationalism as vaguely being the force behind what Putin is trying to accomplish, but I think we mostly think of Putin as a realist and a very logical actor who wouldn't do anything purely because it restores Russian glory, but because of strategic interests. Because, so in how we were talking about our containment being different from Cold War containment, in Cold War containment, ideology was really what would tempt countries to capitulate. And it was kind of a political battle in that sense. Whereas I think we acknowledge that the current situation is much more based on might makes right and the fact that Russia is just comparatively stronger than the countries near it. So while nationalism is an ideology, it doesn't play nearly as large a role as a more strict definition of ideology during the Cold War would have played, I think.
So I guess I'll sort of address the Goldilocks level. So I think that Russia, our thought behind I guess the thinking of the current Russian government is that sort of lashing out when Russia is weak is sort of a way to feign strength, I guess. And obviously compared to some of its neighbors, especially non-NATO members, it has a lot more force at its disposal. And so that's sort of why Russia is. That's why Russia, even when weak, is a threat. And I'm not necessarily sure if there is one particular level of power that we'd like to see. We're more interested in seeing sort of a Russia that is interested in cooperating, interested in working with sort of the system that is set up, and sort of getting its power that way, rather than invading its neighbors and trying to set up its own, sphere of influence and competition with that of the United States.
Just to continue off that, if you look at the rhetoric before 2008, we were starting to talk about Russia as a friend, as someone that we could cooperate with. And after they were emboldened and started taking these actions in Georgia, after the 2008 financial crisis or whatever other answers we have for that, we then started to look at them again as an enemy, whether it was because of their actions, whether it was because they were weakening, they were now in decline. But if you look at the rhetoric before 2008, we did start to see a cooperation with them in some sense. So I think if we can work towards a way to get back to that, I don't know if that's the Goldilocks level. However, I know that the way that we were approaching Russia at that time wasn't as a friend, it wasn't as an enemy, but it was someone we could cooperate with.
Great. Thank you so much. Russia